The American frontier, a place of dusty showdowns, noble outlaws, and lone cowboys staring into a blood-red sunset. Or, at least, that's what the movies would have you believe. The reality? Well, let's just say it was a little less ride or die and a lot more clock in, shovel manure, herd livestock, repeat. See, the so-called Wild West is one of the most deeply mythologized eras in American history, and despite being relatively recent and thoroughly documented, the truth has been smothered under 10-gallon hats and revolver-twirling legends. But today, we're peeling back the cinematic smokescreen. This is the Dusty Ledger, and we're diving into the real story behind the West. Who was actually out there, what life was really like, and why your favorite cowboy might have been more stable hand than sharpshooter. Let's saddle up. Let's start with the cowboy, the icon of the American West. Now, the word cowboy brings to mind a tough, rugged loner on horseback, maybe chewing a toothpick and scanning the horizon for danger. In films, he's a gunslinger, bounty hunter, vigilante, or all of the above. He's practically allergic to authority, except maybe the sheriff, if he isn't the sheriff. But real cowboys? They wrangled cattle, that's it. The entire job revolved around managing livestock, moving herds, branding cattle, fixing fences, chasing strays. It was exhausting, often thankless labor. Think more mud than mayhem. The average cowboy didn't duel at high noon. He swatted flies and hoped not to die from snakebite. Even the term cowboy wasn't originally a compliment. In some Eastern newspapers of the 1800s, it had a negative connotation, implying recklessness or juvenile behavior. If you were respected, you were a cattleman or drover. Cowboy? That was just slang for the rowdy ones. Now here's something they don't teach in Westerns. The cowboy tradition, it didn't start in Texas. It began in Mexico. Long before the U.S. expanded westward, Spanish settlers in the 1600s and 1700s were developing cattle ranching techniques across what is now the American Southwest. These skilled horsemen were known as vaqueros, from vaca, the Spanish word for cow. And let's be clear, everything from lassos and saddles to spurs and wide-brimmed hats came from vaquero culture. The tools, the terminology, even the rodeo. As the U.S. gobbled up land after the Mexican-American War, Anglo-settlers absorbed these traditions wholesale, but instead of calling themselves vaqueros, they adopted a mispronounced cousin of the word, buckaroo. Yup, cowboys were basically cultural copycats, and while Hollywood's version is overwhelmingly white, real cowboys were anything but. Black, indigenous, and Mexican cowboys made up a huge chunk of the frontier workforce. Some estimates suggest 1 in 4 cowboys was black, but try finding that in a John Wayne flick. So if the cowboy myth is shaky, surely the wild in Wild West still holds up, right? Saloon brawls, stagecoach heists, gunfights in every dusty town. Well, not exactly. See, most frontier towns were surprisingly strict when it came to guns. Take Dodge City, Kansas. Upon entering town, you were required to check your firearm with the sheriff, no exceptions. Tombstone, same deal. In fact, the famous gunfight at the OK Corral was literally about lawmen trying to enforce a local gun control ordinance. The real West didn't want to be wild, it wanted to be safe, because chaos was bad for business. And towns weren't built for shootouts. They were built to attract families, investors, and infrastructure. Gunslingers were bad press. In truth, much of the law enforcement was surprisingly well organized. Sure, some sheriffs were corrupt or outgunned, but many were professionals, and the actual threats weren't duels or desperados. They were drought, debt, and disease. Another myth that the West was a land of rugged individualists forging their own destinies, free from government interference. In reality, the West was built by bureaucracy. From the Homestead Act of 1862 to land grants for railroads and military protection for settlers, the U.S. federal government was deeply involved in expanding and stabilizing the frontier. You didn't just wander west and claim a plot. You needed paperwork, surveys. Sometimes entire companies were involved in setting up towns, especially near rail lines or mines. Even the Transcontinental Railroad, a literal spine through the American West, was made possible through massive government subsidies and land giveaways. And yes, this expansion came at a horrific cost. If there's one myth more damaging than all the rest, it's the idea of cowboys versus Indians, a noble clash of civilization and savagery. That's not what happened. Cowboys, remember, mostly herded cattle. The people who fought Native Americans were U.S. soldiers, under orders, with strategy, funding, and overwhelming force. From the 1850s through the 1870s, the U.S. launched a sustained campaign of military conquest across the Great Plains. Native resistance was fierce but uneven. The U.S. held all the advantages: guns, railroads, telegraphs, and time. Brutal tactic? Eliminating the bison, which native economies relied on. Tens of millions of buffalo were killed in a few short decades, mostly to starve and displace indigenous tribes. Pair that with the long-term devastation of disease, broken treaties, and forced relocation, and what you get isn't a frontier war, it's colonization, plain and simple. So with all that said, where did we get this version of the West? You know, the one with spaghetti saloons and spurred boots clinking into town. Well, for that, we can thank Buffalo Bill and Hollywood. Buffalo Bill Cody was a showman who turned his life into a brand. His traveling Wild West show toured the U.S. and Europe, dramatizing frontier life into a mythic spectacle with trick shooters, reenactments, and heroes of the American expansion. By the time movies rolled around, the formula was set. Hollywood loved the Western, a genre with simple heroes, clear villains, and dramatic landscapes. John Ford and John Wayne built their legacies on this fantasy, and audiences couldn't get enough. The frontier became America's moral stage. Never mind that it was full of historical inaccuracies. It was entertainment. It sold tickets. It also quietly erased the reality of who built the West. Chinese laborers who laid the tracks, black cowboys who wrangled herds, Mexican vaqueros who taught the trade, Native Americans who were driven out, not driven back. So, was the Wild West real? Yes, but probably not in the way you think. It was a diverse, often dangerous, heavily regulated, government-subsidized zone of expansion. Cowboys were hard-working laborers. Guns were more restricted than romanticized. And the myth, it came after the fact, written not in diaries, but in dime novels, stage shows, and Technicolor films. The truth is messier and far more fascinating. So next time you see a cowboy ride off into the sunset, just remember he probably had blisters, a low paycheck, and a second job fixing fences. Thanks for watching. If you like this dive into historical myth busting, Consider subscribing for more stories that pull back the curtain on the past. This is the Dusty Ledger, signing off.